So Dr. Russ Kleinman is going to talk about the unique characteristics of ferns and those characteristics that it takes to survive as a fern in the Gila. He was a surgeon. I'm not sure he can tell us for how many years, but he retired early and he just decided to become a botanist. I love that. And I know he has saved a multitude of persons and made their lives better as a surgeon. And I know for a fact that he has enriched many, many lives as being just this person who has come into our area that has created something like the Gila flora. So you go on there and you can look at, over 1,500 species of plants with photographs, with descriptions and locations. You can search it by common name. You can search it by scientific name. You can go and look up families. It's just an amazing, amazing thing. He has been studying mosses, liverworts, and ferns for some years. And he's got projects going on. I know he's got a book. There's a book coming out, I think, hopefully soon on the mosses of New Mexico. His wife, Karen, is one of the two, I think, queens of the liverwort in New Mexico. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Russ Kleinman to talk about the ferns of the Gila.
Very cool. Thank you, Don. Am I unmuted?
You are.
Cool. And I trust everybody is seeing my share screen now. Is that a reasonable assumption?
Yes.
Okay. I'll get started then. Thank you again, Don. I appreciate it. It's always fun to talk about something you're passionate about. Ferns is something I got interested in really not long after I started looking into plants in general. I'm not sure what about them was so interesting to me, but there aren't a lot of them in the Gila, but just enough to keep your interest. There are about 40 fern species in the Gila. Quite some time ago, Alan Campbell and I took a hike into the Little Creek area. We started out at TJ Corral up near the cliff dwellings to shortcut into the upper parts of Little Creek because Alan knew of a southern maidenhair fern in that area. That's the only southern maidenhair fern still that I know of in the Gila. And we got to Little Creek, and this fern is about 10 feet up a vertical cliff that borders the south side of Little Creek. And boy, I sure needed a picture of that. I wanted it for Gila flora. Well, it was a little difficult. You can see from the picture on your screen that it's a little bit vertical on that cliff. The blurry plant in the background against the cliff wall, that's the maidenhair fern. And I got about 6 or 7 feet up that cliff by kind of wedging my feet and my hands onto 3 or 4 inch wide little hold places. And I put my camera about 3 feet above my head with my left hand. And just as I took this picture, I lost my grip with my right hand and started to fall backwards, which wouldn't have been horrible, I hope. I was only 6 or 7 feet up, but that would have hurt. And luckily, Alan Campbell caught me as I came tumbling down. But this is the only picture I got of it. I guarantee you that it is in fact the southern maidenhair fern, but that's the best and only picture I got of it. I didn't go back up there after that to take a look at it. If anybody knows of another southern maidenhair fern in the Gila, I'd sure like to know about that. Let's see if I can get this to advance. Okay, so if we're going to talk about ferns, we probably should be on the same page and at least have some idea what a fern is and what a fern isn't. To start with, a fern is not a flowering plant. In spite of all the legends in Poland and in the Slavic countries of Europe, there's an incredible literature as well as paintings and so forth of the fern flower. There's this huge fern flower legend or mythology in Eastern and Southern Europe. But I'll guarantee you that ferns don't make flowers, and they don't even make seeds. They are spore-producing plants, but they don't make seeds or flowers. So we can start off with that. In spite of the legends, they don't really make flowers or seeds. They do make spores, and they do make these rather large, very delicately divided leaves. And that's something that the lineages on the phylogenetic tree below the ferns don't do. So nothing that originated before ferns makes this beautifully divided, delicate looking leaf that we call a compound leaf. That is not something that is done by the earlier lineages. And in addition, if you look at a picture I'll show you in a little while of what the roots look like on a fern, and you'll see the stems. The stems and roots on a fern don't divide always into equal branches. They can divide unequally, and that's something else that the earlier lineages didn't do yet. So ferns have these delicately divided leaves. They divide unequally, but they don't make seeds and flowers. That's probably as reasonable a way of defining a fern as we can do. These days, in a botanical sense, ferns are mostly defined by DNA, by molecular clues. So that's not terribly helpful to us that are out in the field. Now, I got to thinking about this fern flower legend, and I knew about a fern called lady fern, Aetherium filix femina, and a fern called male fern, Dryoteris filix mas. Filix mas is Latin for male fern, and filix femina is Latin for lady fern. And I wondered if those names had something to do with this fern flower legend. I wondered if they thought that maybe the lady fern was the fern that made the seed back when they thought that ferns made flowers back then. The legend actually, they actually thought this. Some people, some botanists thought that ferns had flowers they hadn't been able to find yet. And they thought that maybe that the lady fern was the female flower producing part of a duet with the male fern being the pollen producing fern. I was wondering if that's what the origin of these terms was. So I did what anyone else with a question about where names come from in New Mexico does. I called Kelly Allred, who really, if you don't know this about him, he is really into where names come from. So he made me aware of the fact that Linnaeus's original 1753 Species Plantarum, the front page of which is right here on your screen on a little itty bitty thing here on the side. But that's available online. So I found out that Aetherium, actually Kelly did this for me, found out that Aetherium and Dryoteris both were in the genus Polypodium in 1753, according to Linnaeus. Linnaeus called this Polypodium filix femina, and he called this Polypodium filix mas back in 1753. And in the second volume of Species Plantarum, on about page 1079, it's a huge work, you find these two, and I was hoping to find where these names came from next when I read about these in his book. Unfortunately, in Species Plantarum, Linnaeus makes it clear that both these terms originated from people before him. So Linnaeus didn't actually name lady fern filix femina or name male fern, Dryopteris felix mass. Those were names that originated before 1753. And so far, I haven't actually found that where those names actually originated. They're old names. But listen, look at this picture here. Here's lady fern. This is Aetherium felix femina, lady fern. And you see this, there's this bright, very fuzzy, out of focus area here. When you look at the paintings from 200 or 300 years ago that have fern flowers in them, they always look like this. All the fern flowers, they're not usually nice and well drawn like this. They're usually fuzzy like this. And this is, so maybe there is a fern flower in there. I don't know. Well, here's such a painting from 145 years ago in Warsaw. This is at a museum in Poland. And let's see if I can move this out of the way. And there's that fuzzy bright area right there in that fern. See that fern down there? There's that fuzzy bright area, just like I had in my shot. So maybe that's where the fern flower is. And as far as the mythology goes, these fern flowers are guarded by an evil spirit. There he is. So we have a fern flower here guarded by that evil spirit. If you can find that flower, you get all kinds of special luck and powers and whatnot. Maybe if you go where that lady fern was, there'll be a fern flower in there. I don't know. All kidding aside, no flowers in ferns, though. They are spore-producing plants. They don't make seeds. They don't make flowers. Here's what they do make. So if you take that lady fern and turn over one of the leaves, we call those leaves fronds. If you turn over the leaf and look at the back side, the bottom side of the leaf, a very small piece of it. So here you're looking at this whole thing here is probably a square inch or something like that. You'll find these structures. Here are the veins of the leaf, the back side of the leaf. And here are all these little brownish to blackish, roughly spherical structures. These are the sporangia in which the fern makes those spores. And you can actually see in here, if you got a good enough detail screen, you can see some spores sitting in here. Most of these sporangia will release 64 spores that will then grow into the next generation of fern. You see this little worm-like thing on here? There's a little worm-like ridge here. And you can actually see individual cells in here because they have such a thick wall between the cells. And they have a thick wall at the base. The outer wall is thin. So what happens is as the water evaporates through this thin outer wall of this worm-like ridge of cells, it contracts. It makes these cells smaller and it tears open the sporangium. It's some special cells that are at the base here. It cocks the whole thing back like a catapult. And when it cocks back far enough, and can't cock back any further, it suddenly catapults all these spores out of the sporangium. And usually it's a couple feet above the ground and they fall to the ground a few millimeters at least further out from where this was, but it catapults them to the ground at least. That's a phenomenon called spore shooting. And it's the function of this funny ridge of cells here to cock this whole thing back and make it into a catapult. Now, the shape of where these sporangia are, this whole thing is called a sorus, S-O-R-U-S, sorus. And the shape of this sorus, which is the arrangement of the sporangia like this, helps determine what genus you've got. So if you're trying to key these things out, even what family it's in, you have to know the shape of this thing. Here, this would be called a kidney-shaped sorus. And you have to know the shape and location of this flap of tissue that protects the developing sporangia. This is called an indusium. It's actually from a Latin word for shirt. It covers the sporangia and protects them. Almost all ferns will have some kind of an indusium, some kind of a covering over the developing sporangia. Sometimes it's just the margin of the frond folded over them, and then it's called a false indusium. Now, I mentioned that one thing that earlier lineages on the phylogenetic tree don't do is make very finely dissected, delicate-looking leaves. So here is a leaf of Terrace fendleri. And actually, this is just a part of one leaf. The leaf actually starts way down here at the bottom. This is about half the leaf. All this is one leaf, half of one leaf. A finely divided one, two, probably, we'd call this a 3 times divided leaf because the leaf is divided into this thing, and then again. So this is a feathery type of appearance or a pinnately divided, pinnately compound leaf. That's what ferns usually do. You just want to call it a delicate looking leaf, that's good enough for me. That's what most ferns do, but unfortunately, when it comes to these morphological features, there are exceptions to everything, almost every rule. And there are some definite exceptions to having these fern leaves be delicately divided. Here you can see walking fern. This is a fern I became familiar with in the Midwest. And they don't have a finely divided leaf. This leaf is entire. It's not divided at all. So there are exceptions to this rule, but it still holds around here pretty well. Okay, so I'll get on to the question of how do ferns survive in this area in just a moment. But a question I get asked fairly frequently is how long have ferns been around? Well, it's actually not that hard a question to answer in some ways because there's a good fossil record. Ferns actually fossilize pretty well, as opposed to mosses and liverworts that don't fossilize worth a darn. But these ferns fossilize pretty well. But the answer is still a little bit complicated. This diagram, you can forget these numbers and the colors. You don't need to look at that stuff. I want you to look at this timeline down here. Here is today. MY means millions of years. So here is now, no years ago. 50 million years, 150 million years ago, 250 million years ago, 350 million years ago, and so forth. Here we are at the earliest fern lineage. Okay, so the horsetails are the earliest lineage on this diagram. And it's generally appreciated or generally felt that the earliest ferns appeared on Earth about 350 million years ago. Here it's a little bit before that. So if we say 350 to 400 million years ago, that's probably a pretty good idea of when the first ferns showed up. Well, that doesn't sound very complicated. So what did I mean by that? Well, the problem is this is the family of ferns that we have in the Gila, the Terrace. This is over half of our species of ferns in the Gila. When did they show up? They showed up here 150 million years ago. So it is true that ferns are a pretty ancient lineage in that they showed up between 350 and 400 million years ago, but our ferns aren't that old. Most of our ferns in the Gila have only been around for about as long as the flowering plants have been, about 150 million years. Okay, on to what I really want to talk about, which is how do ferns actually manage to survive in the Gila? So when we think about ferns, we really don't in a general sense, at least when people in the whole world think about ferns, New Mexico doesn't really come to mind. I'll answer Jason's question here. Jason wants to know if fern fronds are considered true compound leaves, and the answer to that is yes. This is one leaf, and this is one leaf. This is one leaf. So fern fronds, when they are not just simple leaves like that one walking fern I showed you, fern fronds are in fact considered true compound leaves. Okay, so back to this question about adaptations for life in a harsh environment. We don't usually think of, if you were to talk to somebody in Yugoslavia or in Poland, say, they wouldn't think of New Mexico first off when you mention ferns. And that's because our diversity in ferns is not as high as it is in places like Costa Rica or Ecuador. In the tropics, there are far more fern species in the tropics than we have here. They had to adapt to life in New Mexico. And so if you look here on the left, you see Myriopteris tomentosa. This is not a terribly common fern, actually. The genus is common here, but this species isn't. But this is a common way you see our ferns, growing in cracks in rocks, hiding from the sun and hiding from the cold and hiding from fire. They're trying their best to avoid what environmental conditions would otherwise destroy them. So our ferns have learned a lot of ways to deal with environmental conditions, such as hiding from the heat or hiding from the cold. And I realize it's a little bit obscure here what's going on, but each of these little black dots here, and this little guy here, these are all Myriopteris fern fronds also, but they are covered in snow. We have a range of temperatures around here that goes from over 100 degrees to, like it was in February about 6 years ago, it was -8 at our house. So we have a range of temperature of something like 110 degrees in the Gila. So our ferns here have to manage to survive in 100-degree heat and 8 degrees below zero. Not an easy thing to do. How do they do that? Well, there are lots of ways they do it. If you look at a Canadian violet, I don't know why Canadian violets are white, but they are. Here's a Canada violet. If you manage to remove about 10% of the water content of this plant will wilt and die. Most plants can't suffer a loss of more than about 10%, 8 to 12% of their normal moisture content, or they die. On the other hand, if you take many of our arid adapted ferns, this is Myriopteris aurea actually, this one will survive probably about 70% of its water content to be removed before it dies. Some ferns can lose up to 97%, not this one. But this one and most of ours can lose far more moisture than regular non-fern type plants. So this plant would die if you removed as much water as this one. This plant is Myriopteris aurea. This is actually a Mexican fern that's at the very northernmost extent of its range here in New Mexico. For those of you who know this by another name, this is the old Kylanthes Bonariensis. Okay, I told you I'd show you a picture of roots. Here are some of the roots on a fern, and notice that they do not divide into equal branches like the earlier lineages. So definitely the roots have learned how to divide and leave a main axis there. So when it comes to this morphology, you have a leaf. This is the true compound leaf, back to Jason's question. So here's a true compound leaf. Here's the stalk to it, okay. Here are the pinnae. Okay, this is one leaf. It's coming off a stem. This is a horizontal underground stem. We call this a rhizome, a horizontal underground stem. Roots come off the bottom and leaves come off the top, or shoots come off the top of an underground horizontal stem called a rhizome. And this rhizome is critical to how our ferns survive in the Gila. Everything underneath this blue line is underground and not visible. So I mentioned this was a horizontal underground stem. when I dug this up, everything above this line was visible. Everything below this line was not visible. Well, where is it? It's not out in the open. So if you go to the tropics or you go to Maine, like this picture, along the roadsides and trails in many parts of the US and in the tropics, you'll find ferns. This is a cinnamon fern. You'll find ferns growing pretty much unprotected from the sun. This is out there. It's got a lot of shade anyway. So this doesn't have to grow in any particular manner to keep protected from its environment. That's not the way it works in New Mexico. Here's how you find ferns in New Mexico, typically. There are at least two main differences that I can point out right off the bat. Notice that this fern is about 4 or 5 feet across, and these fertile fronds are maybe 3 feet high. That's not the way most of our ferns grow. Unlike the Ethereum and the Terrace I showed you on the first slide, most of our ferns are pretty small and don't grow more than about a foot tall or wide. Here's a maidenhair spleenwort, a Splenium Trichomanese. This is out on Georgetown Road in the Pinos Altos range. It has a rhizome. It has that underground horizontal stem. It's hiding in a crack here. The roots go down further into the crack. You can't see the underground stem, the horizontal underground stem, the rhizome, or the roots because they're hidden in the rocks. Why is it doing that? It grows like this because the rocks insulate it from heat and cold and also from fire. So this fern is protected by the insulating effect of the rock. And as you look around at other species of ferns in the Gila, you'll find lots of them do that. Here is spiny cliffbrake, Pelaya truncata. This is a very common fern in the Gila. Here it's growing on sand, but the rhizome is growing way underneath this is the bottom of a cliff. It's going way underneath the cliff, underneath this bottom rock of the cliff, basically, bottom boulder. So this rhizome, again, is hidden from the environment. The sun can't see it, cold can't see it, and fire can't see it. If fire comes through here, it's going to burn all these top parts, but it's going to leave the rhizome and the roots. Here's Terrace grassless, what we used to call Kylanthes Bonariensis. It grows in limestone, and as you can see, there's a crack here. That's where the rhizome is hiding. Same thing, a relatively small fern, growing protected by rocks and cliffs, where the rhizome is protected from heat and cold. Okay, I promise I won't show you a lot of data. This is the only data slide you'll have to sit through with me. So my question was, back in 2008, my question was, how well does this growth habit actually protect these from fire? It was a question that the National Forest Service was actually asking also. So I ended up giving this data to them. Their Denver office actually wanted this information. So what I did was I went to the Reserve Ranger District and asked them for some help. I knew they were going to do some prescribed burns in the fall of 2008. So I asked them when their next one was, and it was coming up in November, early November of 2008. So about 2 or 3 weeks before this burn was going to happen, I went in the area of the burn, which was in Leggett Canyon, just up from Solis Canyon. If you know 180 on the way to Reserve, it's on 180 on the way to Reserve off to the east side of the road, just past Solis Pass. That's Leggett Canyon, just past Solis Canyon. It's ponderosa pine with some oaks in there, some juniper in there, and some grasses in there. So what I did was I found 5 populations of ferns in Leggett Canyon in the area that I had their map where they were going to burn. So I found 5 populations of ferns, one of which was just outside where they were going to burn. So I put down 1 meter square plots around these 5 populations, one of which didn't burn on purpose. And I counted the number of fern fronds or fern leaves that were taller than about 2 inches and alive. And that's what these numbers are. So this October 2008 column is the number of fern fronds, alive, viable fern fronds in that 1 meter square plot. So I had a Woodsia fern, this is a genus, Woodsia, had 35 leaves in plot 1. I had 65 fronds of, this is now Myrio Terrace, it was Kylanthes back then. I had 65 fronds of this lip fern in plot 2 for my control, and so on. And then in November, they did the burn. And they wouldn't let me back in there until December for my own safety, they said. So I didn't get big. I was in there in October, and I set out my plots with this many fern fronds in them. And I got back in there in December next to see what happened. Well, in the control plot, everything looked fine. I found plot 3. Nothing was left. They completely scorched the top of plot 3. They completely scorched the woodsias. And I couldn't even find plots 4 and plot 5. If you've ever done anything in a burn area, right after it's burned, before anything comes back, it's incredibly disorienting. And in the beginning, I couldn't even figure out where these plots were. I eventually did find them later on. And so by January, I was able to find them. I had GPSed them and put 4 rock cairns around their corners, and I still couldn't find them right after it burned. What I need to tell you, just so you're up to speed with this, these Kylanthes or lip fern plots, lip ferns retain their fronds through the whole year. They're not deciduous. So you would expect that number to persist all the way through. There was a little dropout I noticed in the dry season, but they came back relatively rapidly. So all these, if a fire hadn't intervened, these numbers would not have dropped to 0. They would have maintained around these numbers straight through. Woodsia is a little bit different. Woodsia has deciduous fronds. So woodsias, what happens with them is they're green in the growing season. Then as the fall moves on, they turn brown and eventually die and fall away. And they completely regrow their fronds the following season. So what one would have expected for a woodsia, I don't have a control woodsia, unfortunately, but what one would have expected is that this would have slowly dropped off to 0 somewhere through here and then slowly crept back up. It went right to 0 because it got burned. So what you can see from the data here is I followed these monthly in candid fronds, and as you'd expect, they all got scorched except for the control plot, all the way up to April, and then starting in May of the following year, right when you think they'd be coming out of dormancy anyway, there they are. They took right off. And by September of 2009, they've got about 2/3 of the number of leaves they would have had anyway. And a year after that, this is September 2010, now a year later, they're all almost back to where they started. So the answer is, these ferns, they're hiding in rocks. I'll show you where they were located. And 2 or 3 of these plots, by the way, 2 through 5, were on very steep rock areas where I could have helped. It would have been nice to have Alan Campbell there in case I fell in some of these places. Let me show you plot 1, just to so you get some idea how this worked out. So here's a woodsia population. This is about 400 meters from the road. And there were far more than this, but this is probably the greatest accumulation of fern fronds in plot 1 in my Leggett Canyon study. What I want you to do is keep an eye on this kind of almost circular rock. Keep an eye on that rock, because that'll keep us oriented, because it's going to get kind of hard to be oriented in these pictures after it burns. Keep an eye on that rock and this kind of arc here. There's an arc here and a kind of a roundish rock on top of things here. But there's also a lot of pine duff. There's annual muleys here, I think. There's all kinds of stuff that they were trying to get rid of in terms of fire fuel. This is what it looked like before it burned. And this is a low intensity fire. I should make that point as well. This is a drip torch fire. This is not a natural fire in a poorly thinned area. This is a drip torch prescribed burn, so it would be a low intensity fire. And you'll be able to tell that by following the lichens. Keep an eye on the lichens here. As I go through some of these fire pictures, if the lichens don't appear dead, then it was a low intensity fire. If the lichens are completely scorched off, it was higher intensity. So there's the hint. Keep an eye on the lichens. Okay, so here we are in October. Remember the prescribed burn was in November 2008. Here we are in October 2008. This is either my wife Karen or possibly Carrie Ann Lafferty. Had to have someone help me do some of this because some of it was on pretty steep slopes. This woodsia plot was the flattest of the slopes. What we did was we GPS this area, we put rock cairns at the corners, and we measured out a meter plot. And you can see that there's lots of woodsia. Here's that round rock. Here's lots of woodsia. Here's that arc I want you to keep your eye on. So keep your eye on this arc for the next few pictures and on that round rock. And although you can't see them very well, there are other fern fronds hiding down here as well. These weren't the only ones in this plot, but that was the easiest. These are the easiest ones to see. So let's see what happened. A couple weeks later, they go through a prescribed burn. That's what it looks like. You can see how hard these can be defined. This was incredibly disorienting. If you look back here, you can see there's what looks like a little oak tree here, lots of grass, and the ferns. That oak tree is still there. It's burned. The grasses have been torched. The ferns are completely gone. Here's that round rock. And here's that arc. So the ferns are completely gone at this point. But we know they have rhizomes. And we know the rhizomes, at least at one time right before this fire, the rhizomes were healthy in these rocks. And the question is, you already know from the data, the question is, does the rhizome survive underneath here with a low intensity fire? Well, you know the answer is yes. So let's see what the time course of that is. Here's December 2008, right after the burn, nothing happening. January, here's that round rock. Here's the arc. One rock cairn, another rock cairn, another rock cairn. So here's where those ferns were, nothing happening. The lighting's a little different, but nothing has gone on. It's now been 2 months, nothing's happening. February, here's that round rock. Here's the arc. Here's a rock cairn, another rock cairn, another rock cairn. Well, looky here. It's February. There's a little bit of green right there. There's one grass blade from this clump of grass that seems to be making it back. That's a pretty good sign that it wasn't that high intensity. And you can see that at least some of these lichens haven't been torched either. That's February. March. Look at that clump of grass. It's coming back. Not much else in here is green. Here's that round rock. Here's where our ferns should be. Not much happening there. It's a good sign that the grass is coming back. And you can see, while some of these lichens have been burned away, a lot of them are still alive. So it was a pretty good low intensity fire. Initially took away all this pine duff, which is already starting to accumulate. And the grass is starting to come back. Let's see, let's go into April. Here's April. You can see a little bit more grass come back outside the plot. Here's a little grass inside the plot. Not a whole lot going on. Here's our round rock. Here's our 4 rock cairns. Not much going on in April. Here's May. Oh, goody. What's going on here? Here's our grass clump. Here's our round rock. Here's our arc. And look what's happening. Look at the woodsia coming back here. Look up here. So it's now been, it was burned in November. So December, January, February, March, April, May. 6 months later, probably about when they would have been coming back anyway. You remember these are deciduous fronds. So probably when they would have been coming back anyway, you see these ferns starting to edge back in here. There's May. Here's June. Here's our round rock. Here's our arc. It's not quite as good a growth as it was before we started, but it's getting there. Look, you can see some down here as well now. Even that oak tree is coming back. The grasses are coming back. The ferns manage just fine. So in terms of ability of Kylanthes, which is the new Maidenhair Terrace, the lip ferns and these woodsia ferns to survive a low intensity fire, they don't seem to have any problem. All of the plots came back just fine. So that was a low intensity fire. But what about a high intensity fire? What about if you really burned a ponderosa forest to the ground? Well, those of you who've been around here long enough know there was a Salice Canyon fire not far from Leggett Canyon. So now we're only talking a couple miles south of where the fern plots were that I showed you just a moment ago. And these are pictures taken from Salice Canyon. If you've driven up toward the reserve in the last few years, you've seen these burn areas on both sides of the road, and especially this kind of thing where all you have is burned trunks of ponderosa pine left. And it can be a little spotty. It doesn't always burn the way you think it would, but here's some pretty badly burned areas. This was probably pretty badly burned, is now growing shrubs back. This was probably unburned here. I think I was there about 5 to 6 years after this fire. I don't know exactly, I don't remember anymore exactly when the Salice Canyon fire burned, but it was a few years before the prescribed burn in Leggett Canyon. And in fact, this fire was one of the reasons they did the prescribed burn in Leggett Canyon. Here's what a closer up look view of some of this ponderosa looks like a few years down the road. So the question is, I can't actually, obviously I can't go in there before a natural fire. I think this was lightning started, lightning ignited. And there's obviously no way I'm going to get in there right before the fire and put in 1 meter plots. You can't do that since you don't know when the fire is going to happen. So what I did is I went in there when I did the fern plots to see if I could find any ferns growing back in here. And lo and behold, look what you find. Nice, healthy looking fern populations in there. But also take a look at the lichens here, just as to gauge what's going on. So these fern populations, the ones I found, were growing in the rocks as you'd expect, but this is not a 5-year growth of lichen. This is much older than that. So these ferns probably were an area of the fire that did not burn at very high intensity. At least that's what I would postulate, is that these ferns came back. It did burn where these ferns are, but I'm guessing this was a lower intensity fire. And I'm guessing if you have a very high intensity fire, you probably sterilize the ground for several inches down. And again, look at the lichens. You can tell the intensity of this fire by how badly the lichens are scorched. Okay, let's move on then. What about other adaptations for life in a harsh environment? Well, here is an Astrolepis. This is a fern that we have in Silver City even, although it's a little hard to find unless you know where to look for it. This is what it looks like when it's moist. When it's dry, all these pinnae, these parts of the leaf, they fold in and they expose the back surface of themselves to the environment. And if you look really close into the microscope, this is what it looks like. Well, what's going on here? Well, it turns out that when water hits the backside here of this part of the leaf, this part of the scale is dead. These are individual scales. This part of each of these scales is dead, but the water is absorbed and travels down to this part of the scale, which is alive. And this live part of the scale interdigitates, or the cells of this scale mix with the cells of the whole leaf down further into the leaf. And water is directly absorbed from each of these scales directly into the leaf when it rains. So that this leaf can rehydrate. Each one of these is a leaf. This leaf and this leaf, these leaves can rehydrate in less than 5 hours. They'll look like this again in less than 5 hours. Whereas if they had to absorb the water from the roots, it might take 5 days to get enough water up here to rehydrate like this. And the same thing happens with Fenler's lip fern. This is probably our most common fern right around Silver City. Here's what it looks like when it's happy and well hydrated. You dry this out and it looks like this. And it's exposing the backside, the scale covered surface of the leaf. And here's what those scales look like on this plant. And they do the same thing. They absorb water through here. It's transported down to this part of the scale and then absorbed directly into the leaf without having to go through the roots. It's a great way of absorbing water. Well, you might say, Russ, aren't the stomata, aren't the little areas where water and gases, and especially gas exchange occurs on these leaves, aren't they on the backside? Because frankly, I've heard a lot of botanists say, well, these fronds curl like this to hide the stomata where the gas exchange takes place. That's not what's happening. When they curl like this, they're actually exposing the stomata. They're exposing the backside of this frond. Well, the reason they're exposing the backside of the frond is to expose the scales so that when it rains, it rapidly absorbs water. Well, you might say, well, if they're exposing this backside and exposing those stomata where the gas exchange occurs, aren't they losing a lot of water? Isn't it losing a lot of water to gain some? Well, it is. But remember that this fern can lose 70% of its water content and still survive. So what it's doing is it's losing more water than it would by exposing the stomata, the gas exchange system on the back of these leaves. It's exposing them. They are covered by scales, so they have a little bit of cover from the sun. Exposing those stomata, but it's also exposing these scales. So yes, they lose a lot of their water content, but they gain it back rapidly as soon as it rains. And as any talk about how our ferns are adapted to our environment has to talk a little bit, and I won't show you, I showed you one slide of data. Instead, I wouldn't show you any more data slides. So this is the only life cycle slide I'll show you. Won't show you any more life cycle slides. But in order to understand our ferns and how they survive here, you really have to understand a little bit about the life cycle of ferns. All this is here is what our ferns normally look like. Here's that underground rhizome with the roots going off the bottom and the leaves coming off the top. Typically, on the back side of those leaves, you'd have, remember that short lichen dusium covering the sporangia. Looks just like the picture I showed you of ours with that little wormy ridge that opens up the sporangium. And this leads to germination of a new plant. And this part of the plant in this what we call generation or gametophyte generation is about the size of your thumbnail, and it has a little place where sperm are made and a little place where eggs are made. And the only way eggs get the sperm is by swimming through a water film. So when it comes to a sexual, this is called a sexual life cycle. In the sexual life cycle, there are, in the Gila, there are two places where this fern is really got it rough. The first is that this is a small, thin little structure that has to develop from the spore. And it desiccates very quickly. So the gametophytes don't survive unless they're around water in the Gila. And secondly, another vulnerability, the first vulnerability is this thin, small gametophyte that desiccates. The second vulnerability is the fact that sperm have to swim to the egg. You got to have water. You have to have a water film for that to happen. How often do we get water that sticks around long enough for fern sperm to swim to a fern egg? Probably not all that often. So given that, how do ferns manage to survive? Well, they've adapted and changed this life cycle in certain important ways. Firstly, none of this happens in half of our ferns. In half of our ferns, there never is a sexual life cycle. So they don't make sperm and they don't make eggs. And they don't make a gametophyte that's very large or that lasts more than a few days. They make the spores germinate. They make a little thing that looks like a gametophyte, but it rapidly, simply makes new rhizomes and leaves and never goes through the sexual part of the life cycle. So this whole part of the life cycle is cut off. And our ferns, half of them just do this. As they do it, the spores are not, the DNA is not halved in the spores. The chromosome number is not halved in the spores. So everything in this life cycle is what we call diploid, or has 2 copies of each chromosome, just like you and I do. So in this asexual life cycle, the plant never does get its number of chromosomes halved. In sperm and an egg, there's only half the number of chromosomes here, and they have to join to reconstitute the full number of chromosomes. That doesn't happen in half of our ferns. They skip this part of it. When you don't make gametes, sperm and eggs are called gametes, that's called apogamy. It's a big word, but that's what it's called. This is called an apogamous life cycle. Half of our ferns do this. Why would they do that? Well, you don't need a water film. When our ferns, half of ours, make these spores, they never go below a diploid level. Okay, so they don't need sperm to meet egg. So you don't need this part of it. And you don't need the part that makes the sperm and the egg. So you get rid of this vulnerability and this vulnerability. That helps a lot. In addition, so to start with, if you do apogamy like this, no gametes, asexual life cycle like this, you don't need anywhere near as much water. You don't need this water film from sperm to swim to egg. And you don't need the humidity to maintain this structure. In addition, if you can do this, you don't need to have 2 individuals. You can just kind of do this on and on by yourself. So if one of these spores from our ferns gets carried to take it to an extreme, let's say it gets carried into Egypt, into the deserts of Egypt. And if it finds a suitable rock with enough water, it could germinate, and if it found a good enough habitat, it could go through the rest of this life cycle all by itself, make spores, and make more individuals. And you could have a whole population of this fern without having to have more than 1 individual to do it. Cool. Well, like I said, lots of our ferns do that. 5 to 10% of ferns worldwide do it. Half of ours, or more than half of them, do it. It's common in a Splenium, like this guy, common in our Terrace or lip ferns, common in cliff breaks, Pelaya. It's very common in dry habitats worldwide because you don't have to have as much water. And you don't have to have water because you don't have to have sexual reproduction. Most of the ferns that do this, though not all of them, most of them have 3 sets of chromosomes instead of the usual 2 sets in their nucleus. So if you do some further reading about this, you'll see them described as apogamous triploids. And since 3 sets of chromosomes can't pair up, which is what is needed for sexual reproduction, they can't reproduce sexually. So they have to go through an asexual life cycle. If you really want to be accurate about it, lots of times ferns, when they divide their nucleus, they don't necessarily half their number of chromosomes. And so we sometimes get doublings of chromosomes. And if you happen to be one of these ferns that has 3 sets that can't pair up, but they double their chromosome, you can get a fern that looks like this. It'll look just the same, but it'll have twice 3 or 6 pairs of chromosomes, and suddenly they can pair up. So under certain circumstances, these ferns can reproduce sexually, but they have to double the number of chromosomes in their nucleus to do it. What other things can we say about the ferns in the Gila? That's about all I'll say about adaptations. There are about 40 known species. Half of them are in that one family, the Terrace. It's only about 150 million years old. And about half of our ferns don't reproduce sexually, which is a good thing because it means they don't have to have that water film. Interestingly, there are no ferns on the New Mexico state threatened or endangered list, even though there's been some attempts to put some on there. There haven't been any that have been successfully added. And as I mentioned before, the families sort out by the location, the size and shapes of the sori and the indusium we're covering here. Here's one that's round and anchored in the middle. This one is more linear and anchored all along one end. Here's one where the indusium is simply the edge of the leaf folded over. And I had to put a slide in on the unusual ferns in the Gila, because anytime we have a lot of water, I think I consider that unusual. Here we have Mexican mosquito fern, Azala mexicana. This is a fern you find in the slower moving portions of the Gila River and in the creeks just before they enter into the Gila, where they have more or less perennial water that isn't very fast moving. This fern, each one of these is a separate plant. So this is a group here. You're probably seeing a couple hundred plants in this area. These plants are about the size, again, of your thumbnail. And they have spaces within each of these fronds where they farm a cyanobacterium that adds nitrogen to the plant. And it's called nitrogen fixation. That makes this a very economically important plant in parts of the world. In the United States, ferns are mostly ornamental. But if you're in Asia where you're growing rice and you have to grow rice to live, you like this plant because you need to add nitrogen to the soil. So they take the Azala and they add it right back into the soil in their rice paddies as fertilizer. We also have hooked pepperwort here, Marsilia. It looks like a thickened four-leaf clover. If you didn't know it ahead of time, you sure wouldn't think that's a fern. This is one of the ones we tried to get onto the threatened list a while back, Phanerophilia Ariculada, eared veiny fern. This is not common really in the Gila. It's found in the Gila. It's found also in the Organ Mountains, but it's not common anywhere. The reason we couldn't get it on in the end was because it's really just at its northern range. It's a Mexican fern that is quite common in many parts of Mexico, and it just barely stretches up this far. But it's quite a cool fern to see. It doesn't even look like a fern. That's pretty much all I have to present to you today. I think I'm probably running out of time. If you want to read more, I really recommend this book. You know, there are a lot of botanical books that have a lot to say about ferns, and most of them are quite dry. But here is a really easily readable book that is just really interesting. So if you want to know a little bit more about ferns, much of which I use this book for a lot of this talk in terms of guiding me about what I thought you might find interesting. This book is where a lot of that came from. So Robin Moran's A Natural History of Ferns, I would really recommend that. There you go, Don. That's all I've got. Let's see, are there questions in there? Don, I think it would be good if we could open this up to questions.
Absolutely. So I'm going to unmute everyone, maybe. So does anyone have any questions?
We do have horsetails. So Betty Spence wants to know if we have horsetails. We have at least 3 different species of horsetails, and I know that I kind of ignored them. They are some of the earliest of the diverging ferns. We have 3 of them. They are an older lineage, but they're not the majority of what we have. They do need water. So if you look, you'll need to look along the Gila River or some of our bigger creeks if you want to find the horsetails. That's the genus Equisetum for everybody that Betty Spence was asking about.
Well, Russ, it's really amazing to, you've expanded our perception of native plants. And these are many times things that we get down onto our hands and knees, or maybe we fall 6 or 10 feet and tumble to discover. But it's really amazing. And I'm so happy that we are offering these programs, whether it be on the lichens, or Keller Subatroff is going to talk about fungi and mycorrhizae, and Beth Leik is going to be talking about night blooming cacti, and I think we have Russ's better half, Karen, is going to talk about liverworts maybe in May. So it's just nice to really expand what we consider native plants. And we love the big, beautiful, showy flowers, etc. But it's all part of this ecosystem that we live in. So how do ferns maintain genetic diversity if they don't reproduce sexually?
Great question. Yeah, there's a couple questions coming in on the chat line here that I think we should hit. First of all, ferns are great at having enormous numbers of copies of chromosomes. So if you can't sexually reproduce, next best thing is to have 240 different copies of chromosomes in your cells. Some ferns actually do that. So one of the ways that they maintain diversity is having enormous numbers of copies of chromosomes in each cell. And then there's another question here coming in from Minnesota. There are lots of ferns that we eat, fiddleheads for salads. Do people eat any of the fern here? The short answer is yes, but I want to give you the long answer because it's kind of important. Fern fiddleheads, especially Bracken Fern, are eaten in many parts of the world, especially in Asia, Japan, for instance, where the tender young part of the fern that's erupting out of the ground, the fiddlehead, they're eaten in salads and so forth. There's all kinds of recipes online and pictures of dishes and so forth. I would urge you not to do that. The reason I would urge you not to do that, you probably won't get hurt by eating one fiddlehead, but there are things called plant alkaloids. These are chemicals that plants make for various reasons, one of which is to keep themselves from getting eaten. Many plant alkaloids are poisonous. And among the other things that ferns are really good at doing is they're really good at making plant alkaloids, and they are poisonous. So not only can ferns be poisonous in the acute sense, fern fiddleheads frequently have a chemical in them that is known to cause stomach cancer. And people who eat large amounts of fern fiddleheads have a greatly increased risk of stomach cancer. So there's the risk. You can go out and collect fern fiddleheads for salads, but as you eat them, you are increasing your risk quite substantially of coming down with stomach cancer. So there's the answer to the question. There are fern fiddleheads that people eat in this area. The same ones that are eaten in Japan, actually. They use Bracken Fern there as well. And they're eaten here as well. But it's really not a good idea, mainly because of the carcinogenicity of them. And we have another question. Are all the ferns of the same species within a close area clonal? That can be a difficult question. A lot of the areas where you have a lot of ferns in one close area, a lot of them are a few clones. I wouldn't say they're all the same clone. You can usually tell where a rhizome starts and ends. So it's really it's what you're looking at is one plant. When you think you have a clone, you're frequently looking at one plant with a long underground rhizome that's sending up shoots from that rhizome. So the term clonal is a little bit misleading in that sense. So frequently you have one plant with a long rhizome that looks like a clone, and then you'll have another plant that's near it that looks like another clone, but it's really just another plant with a long rhizome. Mary asks, does cooking destroy the alkaloids? That's a question I'm not sure about. I have to do a little bit more reading about that. There's more than one alkaloid and more than one fern that people eat. So with regards to a particular fern, you'd probably have to look up that answer for the exact fern you're talking about. I think worldwide, probably Bracken Fern is the one that's most eaten, and I don't really know the answer to that with regards to Bracken Fern. Let's see, Jason asks, due to the higher moisture requirement of the gametophytic stage, might that be a reason why so many of our ferns are restricted to rock crevices? Isn't our Marsilia species related to Nardoo? It is Nardoo in Australia, which the Aborigines have learned how to eat the sporocarps. The answer is, let's see, the answer to the second part is yes. So Nardoo in Australia is a Marsilia. And I'm not sure how they detoxify the sporocarps. I'm sure the sporocarps are poisonous. And I believe they have to do 2 or 3 steps to detoxify them, but I don't know the exact, I don't really know the exact steps they have to go through to eat Nardoo in Australia there, Jason. I know they have to do, heating it probably has something to do with it. The higher moisture content, the gametophyte stage. Yeah, the rock crevice thing is mainly because of their need to be protected from both heat and water. So the answer to that part of your question is also yes. The gametophytes, they would be also best served by being protected from heat and ice and so forth. So I think the answer to both your questions is yes, Jason. Let's see. Another way to ask the same question on the clonal question. Are the plants growing from the spores clonal with the parent plant and asexual reproduction? That's a good question. So the answer to that is yes. The spores produced asexually are essentially just an asexual propagule, a clone. If you want to look at it that way, yes. The genetic makeup of those spores will be identical to the parent plant.
So Russ, if a person wanted to go out, sort of a neophyte on ferns, and wanted to find some good places locally to go and to see ferns and start to learn them, you know, it'd be nice to have the natural history of ferns at hand. But where would a person go?
They are really just about everywhere in the Gila, and in the city also. Where we live here in PJ Woodland, almost anywhere you find a rock crevice, you'll find a fern growing out. If you go up anywhere, just drive up to your favorite little spot in the Gila. A lot of people in the Gila Native Plant Society like Little Cherry Creek Ranch Road. Drive up to Little Cherry Creek Ranch Road and look in some of those rock crevices and you'll find ferns growing out of there. Now, if you want to find Bracken Fern or some of the winter deciduous ferns like Bracken Fern or the woodsias, you'll have to wait until the spring because they won't be out this time of year anymore. If you want to find the Myrio Terrace, they may be curled up at this point, but you'll find them growing out of rock crevices everywhere up there at Little Cherry Creek Ranch Road or almost anywhere else in the Gila. Let's see. Is there much mutation in the chromosomes? Betty Spence asks. That's an interesting question. I'm not sure how to answer that. When it comes to the diploid spores, there probably isn't a lot of mutation any more than anything else, but I suspect, again, it's going to depend upon the species you're talking about. Not sure how to answer your question there, Betty. When I see ferns, they look pretty desiccated and therefore hard to identify. Yeah, but most of our ferns that curl up, when those fronds curl up to show the back, if you pick one of those fronds and put it in water, it will rapidly rehydrate. So if you pick one of those fronds, stick it in your pocket, get it home, and just put it in water, it will rapidly rehydrate, and you'll be able to see the non-desiccated or the fully happy version of the fern. Does grazing harm fern populations? You know, when you see ferns, they don't really look like they've been grazed very often. I don't have any data on grazing on ferns. That'd be an interesting question for Dr. Norris. Bill, you still out there?
Yes.
How about grazing in ferns?
I don't have an answer to that question.
I don't either. I think probably they don't have enough food content to make it worthwhile. That'd be my first impression there of the answer to that question is that it's really not worth the while of cattle to be grazing on ferns. I do know that cattle grazing on Bracken Fern will get ill. They don't get stomach cancer, but I think cattle grazing on Bracken Fern, somewhere in the back of my head, I remember about cattle grazing on Bracken Ferns is that there are other plant alkaloids in the Bracken Fern that make the cattle ill. So the plant alkaloid end of things with some of these ferns will keep cattle from grazing on them.
So let's take maybe one more question.
If there are multiple copies of chromosomes, how does the plant decide which copy to express when it produces asexually? It turns out that's a great question. The process by which it's not so much which gets expressed, all the chromosomes get passed on. So when we talk about diploid spore production, it's actually not the same as meiosis. So if you're thinking about meiosis or the usual formation of spores by a cell division process called meiosis, parts of meiosis are glitched when you make a diploid spore. And the whole, if you read about how diploid spore formation occurs, there's actually more than one pathway. It's actually a glitch in meiosis that makes it so that the chromosomes don't have to pair up. So all the chromosomes actually get passed on. How they decide which part of which chromosome is expressed in the adult fern, that's a question that's still under investigation in terms of how genes are turned on and turned off. That's still out there in the realm of investigation.
All right. Well, Russ, thank you very, very much. That was absolutely excellent. A great round of questions. So we will not have a program in December. However, if you are a member and are on our Gmail list, we'll have our newsletter coming out and some special bulletins anyway coming out. And what I hear is that we're going to have a special video produced with sort of a holiday flavor to it, and we've heard that Ranger Roy and Dusty Dale might be singing some country music duets together, cowboy duets. So that's something to look forward to. And I'd just like to thank all of you for dropping in. As far as the election results, it looks like we're going to go into a recount. And so I think in at least 2 weeks, we should have the results of that election. By the way, stay tuned. Thank you. In January, Dr. Kelly Allred, Flora Mexicana, brand new batch of books. And I think it's his knowledge of plants and naming and history, and it's going to be really, really fascinating. So thank you all, and check out our website, gilanps.org. This program will be recorded as many of our other programs, and we're going to be good to go. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Great program. Thank you. Great program.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, Gwen.
Hi.
Thank you. We're muted too.
Thanks.